Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us at this IAVE webinar. My name is Wendy Osborne. I'm a senior consultant with IAVE, and I will be your moderator for this session today. We're just waiting on people joining us in the room, and we're delighted to have so many participants. The title of the webinar is Let's Talk Volunteering, exploring future issues and trends focused on research from the Europe region. And we hope that this session will enhance understanding of global trends in volunteering by bringing together some key recent research from Europe. It is part of a 3-webinar series that started in January with the first webinar exploring 3 pieces of global research on volunteering published in 2021, including IAVE's Leadership for Volunteering, the COVID-19 Experience Report, Forum's COVID-19 and the Future of Volunteering for Development Report, and the United Nations Volunteers Programme State of the World's Volunteerism Report for 2022, Building Equal and Inclusive Societies. And showcasing the findings within these strategic reports and considering the issues they jointly highlight and what this means for the future of volunteering was really important and very well received. However, IAVE was also aware that research has also been carried out in several regions of the world. And while this research is very pertinent to the country or the region it is focused on, we believe that the evidence is also relevant and of interest to the wider global volunteering community. The second webinar in March featured the Asia Pacific region, and this final webinar featured research from Europe. And we will bring together 2 pieces of research, one pan-European and one focused on the UK. And we'll also include a presentation of CEV's Centre for European Volunteering, New Blueprint for European Volunteering 2030. So we really get a sense of the issues that have emerged during and post the COVID-19 pandemic and what this is telling us about the future of volunteering, not for Europe certainly, but also if you're not in Europe and you're not joining us from within Europe, I'm sure you will see synergies from your own experience of volunteering in your own part of the world. I'm going to start by introducing the speakers. I will say that at this moment in time, we are still awaiting Gabriella Civico. So, and hopefully Gabriella will be able to join us very soon. The first piece of research we're looking at is a pan-European volunteering study, which was undertaken for the European Economic and Social Committee to consider changes in the European Union within the field of volunteerism, volunteering, and volunteer activities. It resulted in the publication in 2021 of the research report, New Trends in the Development of Volunteering in the European Union. And I'm delighted today that we have Professor Dr. Lucas Meijs, Professor of Strategic Philanthropy and Volunteering at the Rotterdam School of Management, Erasmus University in the Netherlands, who was part of the research study. And Professor Meijs' research focuses on issues related to volunteer and non-profit management, cross-sector relations as in corporate community involvement and co-production and involved learning and service learning. He is published in a variety of non-profit business and public policy journals, and he has served for 7 years as a member of the Dutch Council on Social Issues, the official advisory body of the Dutch government, and in the National Task Force for Volunteering Policy. And we're delighted to have Professor Meijs with us today. The second piece of research we'll be looking at is showcasing mobilizing voluntary action in the 4 UK jurisdictions. And that would be England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. Learning from today, prepared for tomorrow. Now, this research has just been completed, the study has just been completed. The data is being archived and the book is being written. And we're delighted again today to have Dr. Jurgen Grotz with us, who was part of that research study. And Jurgen is the director of the Institute for Volunteering Research at the University of East Anglia. He has over 2 decades of experience in applied research across the academic, public, private, and voluntary sectors. His international and largely interdisciplinary work on volunteering and volunteer involvement has a strong focus on participative approaches and public engagement. And most recently, he was a member of the international consortium writing the UNV State of the World's Volunteerism Report. And we're delighted to have Jurgen with us today as well. So I still don't see Gabriella. So what I'm going to ask now is for Lucas to start his presentation, and hopefully Gabriella will join us later during the session.
Wendy, thank you very much. Let me start with sharing my slides. And that seems to work. Yes. All right. Thank you very much. As far as I see, nobody's reacting, so it seems to be working. Thank you very much for the honor to give a presentation on this report we are allowed to do. It's called New Trends in Development of Volunteering in the European Union. And it was a beautiful opportunity to connect our conceptual thinking and a worldwide conceptual thinking on volunteering with a small empirical study in Europe. Let's start. So we have this Dutch famous soccer player who said, once you see it, you always see it. And this is one thing that suddenly hit when we're doing this research. In our perspective, we differentiate volunteer energy from volunteering. So volunteering is what you make as an organization out of volunteer energy. And volunteer energy is what individuals are willing, capable, or available to volunteer. And the good and sad news of the last 5 to 10 years, starting with COVID, but also a little bit before, and now with Ukraine, is we cannot complain anymore about a lack of volunteer energy. Volunteer energy seems to be available in many countries. But then we get an interesting one, because the second one is that you, in order to make volunteer energy into volunteering, you need opportunities to volunteer. And the interesting first thing what we saw in this research is that in a country like the Netherlands, where our university is based, where I come from, about 50% of the people volunteer. And volunteer involving organizations complain about the lack of volunteers. In a country like Croatia, where we did some part of our empirical research, and we had some discussions, about 10% of the people volunteer. And it seems that non-profit organizations are not complaining about a lack of volunteers. That's interesting. So in a country where people volunteer a lot, volunteer involving organizations complain. And in a country where are less percentage of people are volunteering, they don't complain as much. And the explanation is the opportunities to volunteer. In the Dutch context, but maybe also in the Finnish context, the UK context, there are many opportunities to volunteer. So we complain. The example we use is the example of volunteer-run animal ambulances, which, as far as we understand, are almost not there in Croatia, and even maybe not at all. And in the Netherlands, there are a lot, but if you have volunteer-run animal ambulances, you also lack sometimes drivers. So that's the first thing really to remember. We should not study volunteering if we want to have more volunteers or enable volunteering. If we want to enable volunteering, we should study how is volunteer energy created? How do we make certain that people are willing, capable, and available to volunteer? And there's not a problem. We can help them. And what happens if they make themselves available? If they start producing volunteer energy, is there a volunteering infrastructure that helps them, that gives them the opportunity to volunteer? Because otherwise, this volunteer energy goes to waste. Or, as we see now in the COVID situations, especially in wave 1, or now again with the Ukraine, people will do something themselves. So that's what we look at. In this research project, we looked at a step in the process. So we see that volunteering is a value chain with 3 steps. The first one is creating volunteer energy. Now, creating Again, forget the word, it's not a problem. It's access to volunteer energy. Volunteer energy is plenty. Second is guiding volunteer energy. That is what we traditionally call management of volunteers. And the third one is a question, how do we recycle current volunteers and how do we make certain that the way that we treat volunteer energy is sustainable, so that volunteer energy is not a resource at risk, but is a resource that will be there for years and years and years. Now, in this research, we focus on the question, how does volunteer energy translate into volunteering and what's happening there? So, to give the answers right away, what we found, we see that there are two pan-European trends of converting volunteer energy into volunteering. But it's also about finding volunteer energy. So about how do you harvest, how do you collect this volunteer energy? And the first trend is what we call the third parties or the third party themes. So volunteering is something that needs to be organized. And instead of volunteer involving organizations asking individuals, we now see other organizations like companies, schools, universities, national days of service, but also family volunteering. And my favorite one with students, single volunteering, where we connect dating to volunteering. So instead of dating and having dinner together you now do an act of volunteering, and it helps. The funny thing is, will single volunteering lead to family volunteering? But we see though that there's a kind of third party that organizes it, and it has a specific instrumental goal with the volunteering. Then the other one is the totally opposite. So the third party volunteering is highly organized. Might be in many cases episodic, so not ongoing, but it's highly organized. The spontaneous volunteer reacts from crises is like this. We see something happening and we start doing. Might also be cleaning up the streets. Might also be helping out the neighborhood. Might also be you're sitting, you had a nice dinner, nice barbecue, and you see the mess in the street and you decide to clean it up next week. That kind of spontaneous volunteering is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, also because we have more opportunities to self-organize. We do not need big organizations anymore to do something. See the stories in Europe about all these people driving themselves to the green to help refugees. All these people offering to help out without contacting the big organizations, without contacting municipalities. So that leads to new profiles or existing profiles. I'm not going to discuss this in detail. You can read the report. But next to the traditional volunteer, we see now new profiles. And these new profiles you can place on the four definitions, the four building blocks of any definition of volunteering. So there's always something about the free choice, about the remuneration, about the organizational structure, and about the beneficiaries. And then we see, for example, that the spontaneous volunteer is very informally organized, while the third-party volunteer is much more like the kind of remuneration is the instrument. It's clear what you get, are very clear benefits. So we see that the original perception of volunteering is broadened, it becomes wider and wider. We also see that to organize that, you need different kind of scenarios. What we call a volunteer scenario is in between volunteer energy and volunteer opportunities. You write down what is the availability you want, we need, what is the asset you need, what is the assignment you can do. But it doesn't work that way because volunteers talk back and say, well, I'm not available tomorrow. I might be available next week. No, I might be a treasurer somewhere, but for your organization. So it's a kind of negotiation kind of thing. And the image we use in this article, in this report, is the volunteer slot machine that has 3 tumblers. And instead, the slot machine is supposed to make profit for the owner. In this case, the slot machine is supposed to pay off for the organization and the volunteer. So we see a traditional scenarios, we see new episodic scenarios, and we see virtual scenarios. These are known. We know them from literature already. But the new ones are, what can we do in spontaneous scenarios? Can we be prepared for the spontaneous energy that will come in the next crisis? Can we organize third-party scenarios? And can we, if we can organize corporate volunteering, can we also organize single volunteering? Can we also organize service learning? If we can organize for one team, what does it mean? But it might be that if we do corporate volunteering, it's slightly different from service learning for universities. So, two things. Do not keep too strict to the idea, I call this volunteering, because the world is redefining volunteering. And secondly, make many more scenarios. So with that, I'm getting slowly to the end of this introduction. So we see that there are large differences in volunteer participation, but we cannot explain it by the energy. We see that some countries, the pyramid of volunteer time is like this. Not volunteering, not the amount of people volunteering, but who donates time. And we see that in the volunteer infrastructure, countries can invest in supporting third parties. They can remove the barriers for spontaneous volunteering. And instead of asking volunteers what to do, it's about negotiating between the volunteers and the organization. So with that, I think there are 3 new policies and research ideas. The first one is, how can we create more energy, more new sources? How does it work? How do we get access to volunteer energy? How do we get access to the untapped reserves? How can we create a sustainable situation? Secondly, how can we prevent that in this arrow from volunteer energy to volunteering, we exclude people? Or how can we create an arrow that makes certain that people are included, that they do not select themselves out of fear that they will be rejected? And the third policy and research question is, how do we improve the sustainability and the circularity? How do we improve that people stay volunteering? And the big thing is there, you should not only focus on having them volunteering for your organization. No, it's about the lifetime value of volunteers. A volunteer sabbatical might save volunteer energy for the future. Thank you for listening. Now, let us change the future of volunteering.
Thank you, Lucas. Thank you very much. And I'm delighted to say that Gabriella has joined us. I'll leave off introducing Gabriella just at the moment. So I'll ask her to switch off her video, and I'll keep to the agenda, and we will now have Jurgen make the presentation. I will also say what I forgot to say at the beginning is that please, participants, and I see we really are global today, which is excellent. Please use the question and answer box to put in your comments, ask your questions, and we will come back to those for the panel discussion. So thank you, and now it's over to Jurgen. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me. I'm just checking that I'm not muted. I always do that. It's an absolute privilege to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And so nice to see as well some familiar names. Hello, Undral, and hello, Elise. Hello, Mike. It's lovely to see that you're here. I'm Jurgen Grotz, the director of the Institute for Volunteering Research, and I will be speaking about volunteering research during the pandemic and how what we found relates to global trends. In particular, I will be speaking about a project I was involved in called Mobilizing Voluntary Actions in the 4 nations of the UK. As is customary, let me point out that the research was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council as part of UK research and innovation. Of course, the views expressed now and in the conversation later are entirely mine. I want to start with 3 quick observations about volunteering research during the pandemic. The first is that it's different when you're in it. That's what a friend who is a nurse once told me about the difference between knowing about something and experiencing it yourself, especially if it is health related or affects someone close to you. The second observation is about an email that I received over the weekend. The email read, and I quote, "The National Institute for Health Research has been affected by COVID." Really? This was to explain that they couldn't respond to inquiries at this stage, but the irony of that statement seemed to be entirely lost on the sender. And finally, this morning I took part in a conference with Gypsy, Roma, Traveller, Showman and Boater communities looking at their access to healthcare. I'm mentioning this to try and open your mind to the complexities of the effects the pandemic has, for example, on volunteer involvement in the vaccination programs that are unlikely to have reached those communities through volunteers. It's clear that the pandemic is far more than a medical emergency. It's a social event disrupting everyone's personal and professional lives, the economy, and all aspects of society. And it also disrupts the practice of voluntary action. I encourage you to think back to what you did in April 2020. I was housebound in social isolation. I was bewildered, feeling frustrated, and feeling helpless. For me as a researcher, it was really frustrating. Here was a natural experiment happening literally in front of my eyes, and I couldn't do anything. So I got together with some colleagues, and we tried to capture in a systematic way some of what we saw. There's so much we didn't understand, and we were also desperate to try and help to do our bit by learning something that might be useful in the future. As researchers of volunteering, it was clear from the outset that we would collaborate with our colleagues in voluntary and community sector organizations and the policymakers who would influence voluntary action during the pandemic. It's worth remembering that at that time, online meetings weren't the norm, and I can tell you some of them were really awful. At that stage, we also recognized that the volunteering, the government volunteering responses were not a UK-wide issue, but related to the devolved powers. I won't expand on this, but effectively it meant that the governments in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland would make independent decisions on those. So we straight away reached out to academics, sector colleagues, policymakers in all those 4 nations and created a very large team. As you can probably imagine, working across 4 nations, looking at the impact of the pandemic, which was ongoing on all aspects of voluntary action, was incredibly complex and constantly changing. You probably also know that people don't always agree on what voluntary action is or what it does. We needed to get a shared understanding about what activities this project would actually consider. And so we created this graphic, which is available on our website. I'll show you that later. The other big issues for us was that we needed to constantly adapt because that pandemic just did not stop. By chance, thankfully, we had planned for most of it to be managed online. However, as soon as the work started, we confirmed that what we expected, that national level responses were differently. But what we hadn't thought about is that the actual local responses were very different as well. And when I say responses, I mean what government did, local and national government did. Not just in relation to voluntary action, but also in relationship to the pandemic more widely. So like in other parts of Europe, we noted something in the UK that now responses were different on either side of borders we had for quite a long time not realized or recognized. When we then explored the context, these various contexts, we began to observe the interactions between the effects of the restrictions like lockdown, the effects of financial support programs such as furlough in the UK, and the stresses, the various stresses put on volunteer involving organizations and volunteers. Volunteers were stood down by some volunteer organizations, others had to adapt. People on furlough started to organize themselves, like Lucas just mentioned, and volunteer organizations halted or had to reconfigure their services. Thankfully, we weren't the only ones who were undertaking research, and so we could look at the other emerging research, and some themes immediately resonated. The first was the emerging mutual aid and hyperlocal activities, and Lucas referred to that in a sense. Especially in the first lockdown, local groups emerged that helped with food and medicine delivery. Researchers from the new local government network reported that, and I quote, "a great reservoir of latent goodwill and community spirit, which can translate into actual capability in times of crisis," what Lucas describes as that energy. However, over time in our research, we found that this can be also very complex and difficult. Another theme was a new will for collaboration and partnership between groups that would not usually work together. Our Scottish colleagues spoke, for example, of, and I quote, "a new can-do attitude that brushed aside a lot of the bureaucracy and other barriers to make change happen." And finally, a really important one is the pandemic put a spotlight on inequality and need. On existing inequality, existing need, but also on new ones. While the other themes were as well the lack of the access of technology, which enabled some of the responses, but also led to new inequalities. And then one that I want to briefly mention is we found that, for example, disabled volunteers appeared to have been more excluded than non-disabled volunteers, and that this has not yet returned to pre-pandemic levels. As we had access to user data from volunteer matching apps, we could see quite literally the willingness for individual responses in the massive spikes of volunteers offering to do something at the beginning of each lockdown, that energy that Lucas speaks about. However, there was great difficulty in translating this willingness into actual volunteering. And we saw that, for example, at local level, our colleagues in Northern Ireland reported that coordination varied depending on the depth of pre-existing partnership working. That also resonated with the reports from England. And of course, it greatly varied at the national level, as I've explained, where in England we had seen a decade of disengagement, but in Scotland, a much, much, much closer collaboration over a decade. In Wales, the sort of closer collaboration had only more recently started, but was pre-pandemic. And in Northern Ireland, there were effects of the sort of ongoing uncertainty, political uncertainty. What was very clear, very, very quickly, that we were not well prepared for the pandemic or the role that voluntary action could play. Those with pre-existing good relationships got quicker off the ground. Others are still working on that. In terms of looking and preparing for the future, for future crisis and the role voluntary action can play in that, we think that the differences in national and local approaches will influence those. But of course, we strongly feel that it's still too early to say, as we are still living with the pandemic. I'm trying to rush through just to reassure Wendy here that I won't be much longer, because not just because of the exceptional circumstances of this work, but also our commitment to co-production. We wanted to make sure that this is very accessible. All the findings are useful for the practitioners who we worked with. So we set up our own website. We post where you have podcasts, briefings, working papers, and most importantly, and that's where the picture is about, we have now a free open access ebook coming out in October that summarizes both the national pictures individually in chapters, but looks across. My concluding remarks are firstly about co-production. and why I'm so pleased to have been involved in this project. Co-production in research is a difficult and contentious concept. For some, including me, it captures a way of undertaking value-driven research where those directly affected by the research work together with researchers to reach outcomes usable for all. The difference in this project is the researchers were also directly affected. And how does all this relate to the global trends? As I've pointed a few times, like Lucas said, it highlighted that people wherever they live, and given that they experienced the pandemic in very similar ways, responded to it, however, with a great willingness to respond. And I don't know, Wendy, whether you remember, and we've got colleagues here who were there. We heard from a number of colleagues from around the globe how that really wasn't. That's not just a European phenomenon. You know, that was around the globe. However, and this is how this piece of work relates, is nations and local governments deal with voluntary action and the pandemic differently, and that has a direct impact. It can be enabling or disempowering. Initially, it seemed to depend on whether or not government had active partnerships. Later, it depended more on whether or not they intended to develop those partnerships. The question for the trends overall is that the UK picture for that is that there isn't a UK picture. It's a devolved, a diverse picture, both nationally and locally. And in answer to the question for today's webinar, the research suggests that, like with the UK, the global trend is that there isn't a global trend, and that the situation of voluntary action is predominantly dependent on national and local context. Please feel free to contact me. I'm sure you will be able to get to the slides. Have a look on the project website where there's some of the information that I've referred to, but also have a look on the Institute's website where we've got plenty of resources available. And thank you very much for listening, and back over to Wendy.
Thank you, Jurgen. Thank you. And now we have Gabriella. So Gabriella will give her presentation, and it's about the recently published CEV Blueprint for European Volunteering 2030. It's intended to be a piece of guidance to CEV, the Centre for European Volunteering, and other stakeholders concerned with volunteering, especially policymakers, regarding the steps they need to take to be taken for volunteering to reach its true potential. And I suppose this is a sort of framework document that CEV has produced, which builds on some of research evidence and information and knowledge from organisations across Europe. And I'm delighted that Gabriella Civico is now with us, Director of CEV, the Centre for European Volunteering, to talk about this very important framework today. Gabriella, his professional background is in business and the youth NGO sector, where she's worked first as administrator and then as a trainer and expert in both paid and voluntary capacities. She was involved in the campaign to establish the 2011 as the European Year of Volunteering, and she has worked closely with the Centre for European Volunteering CEV since 2010 in her role as project manager for EYV. That's what it was known as, EYV 2011. Seems like a long time ago now, Gabriella, until the end of the project in 2012 when she became the CEV director. You're very welcome, Gabriella, and we now have your presentation.
Thank you very much, and I apologize for the delay. Some unforeseen circumstances that I know, unfortunately, we're all becoming more and more used to encountering in our days. So hopefully you can see the screen. I'm going to present to you the Blueprint for European 2030, BEV 2030, as we like to call it. And as Wendy has explained, this is a policy framework, a vision of what we think, especially policymakers, but also volunteering organizations, volunteering infrastructure organizations, should be focusing on to improve volunteering in Europe over the next 10 years. Wendy mentioned there the European Year of Volunteering 2011. I think that was actually where I met Wendy and actually many of you for the first time. I have been a volunteer for most of my life, but 2010 moving into 2011 gave me the opportunity to really put volunteering in my professional focus, and I was working 100% of the time on volunteering. And at the end of 2011 and moving into 2012, we published the policy agenda for volunteering in Europe. This was a list of policy recommendations and other resources and material, tips and tricks about how to improve volunteering in Europe based on the information and evidence that we gathered during 2011, together with all the members of the European Year of Volunteering Alliance. In 2021, of course, it was the 10th anniversary of 2011, and we felt it was a timely moment to revisit the policy agenda and see what issues we should address, update, invigorate, and what issues were new trends, new things that were emerging that weren't in PAVE that needed to be given more attention. That work developed into what we now call the Blueprint for European Volunteering 2030. And here you can just see one of the main underlying frameworks that we wanted to give the blueprint is that we are very aware and are very aware that policymakers often see volunteers as a service delivery mechanism. They see volunteers and volunteering as a way to deliver policy on the ground in a cost-effective way. We want to bring to policymakers a much broader vision, a much more complete vision, a much more wholesome vision that volunteers, yes, deliver important services, but they play perhaps an even more important role in building social cohesion in our communities, in helping people develop interpersonal relationships outside of their families, that it's a way of expressing European values of democracy, human rights, inclusion, etc. And it's an important source of real and genuine social transformation above and beyond service delivery mechanisms which sit within the status quo. So these ideas about the vision that we want to bring to policymakers underpin everything in the blueprint. The ideas in the blueprint are gathered around 5 thematic areas. The first one, and everything builds from there really, is about the importance of independent and inclusive engagement of volunteers and of people through volunteering. We looked at newcomers to volunteering, so new volunteers and also new and emerging methods around volunteering. We looked at empowerment within and through volunteering, how to appreciate the contribution of volunteers, and what resources and coordination mechanisms need to be in volunteering so that we can realize its true value. The sub-themes in chapter 1, which focus on independent and inclusive engagement, you can see them here. We highlight the need for transparent and democratic state funding, that all volunteering organizations which adhere to basic human rights principles and share our values can have access to. That there should be mechanisms and ways where transnational cooperation and solidarity can take place. That volunteering is an important resource for local community development, democratic engagement, and collaborative networking between people and organizations from different fields and sectors. And that dignity and freedom should be at the heart of this inclusive engagement that we want to base the volunteering on. In the areas that we looked when considering new volunteers and new or newer methods for volunteering, we focused on the emergence of non-formal volunteering in Europe, so volunteering which is outside the scope of the legal framework for volunteering in the countries, or outside of the framework of formal associations or organizations on volunteering. We looked at digitalization and how this was impacting on volunteering, either through volunteering online or through online mechanisms to facilitate volunteering. We looked at synergies, or actually across much of Europe, the lack of synergies between volunteering policies and health and welfare policies, where often people who are claimants of health and welfare support from the state are very often prevented from volunteering, or at the very least barriers are put in their way to stop them volunteering. We looked at the emerging industry of volunteerism and how that can be done in a quality way, which respects the ethics and values and principles that we want to underpin all volunteering. We looked at the changing employment situations that many people in Europe are facing, with more precarious work, with more unpredictable work, with having difficulty in planning their volunteering around their work life. And we looked at how to ensure that even with all these new ways of engagement and these new models of volunteering, how we can always ensure quality and ensure that the values of volunteering are shining through. In the third chapter, we really looked at how we can empower people of all backgrounds, of all situations to volunteer, and how we can empower the volunteering organizations themselves. How can we make sure that organizations have the resources so that they can be sustainable and stable? What legal and policy frameworks need to be put in place so that these organizations can be really empowered to enable volunteers to have an impact on social inclusion in their community and really be enabled to make that change that they want to see. The fourth chapter looks at how we can appreciate the contribution of volunteers beyond service delivery, so beyond just the point that services are being delivered, but how can we really understand better through proper research and measurement what is the genuine impact for society of those volunteers, both in economic terms and in social terms. We look in this chapter at the importance of validation of learning. We know that learning is not the main purpose of volunteering, but we also know that most people, while they are volunteering, are learning. They're learning by doing. How can we get that learning validated? And how can we really help the general public, as well as policymakers, communicate? How can we communicate better to them what societal challenges these volunteers are addressing, how they are addressing them, and how in many cases they are being more successful than other approaches which don't involve volunteer engagement. The final chapter looks at resources. How can we harness resources to get more value out of volunteering? How can we make sure that investment in volunteering is really having social impact? We focus on the importance of taking care of the frameworks that volunteers are acting in. So how can we properly train, manage, and support volunteer managers and volunteer mentors? We look at what is the genuine and real role of online matching systems so that they don't try to completely replace the person-to-person contact when volunteers need to be matched with suitable roles. We looked at the importance of community resilience and the role of volunteers in community resilience and the importance of forward planning to make sure that volunteering is part of the resilience approach, especially at the local level, and making sure that they're properly supported and the volunteers are part of the planning so that when we see crisis, I know that the previous speakers have mentioned, of course, this crisis, the COVID, now with the Ukrainian refugees and the importance of volunteers. And we emphasize very much the need for local authorities, regions, national governments to really build community resilience and the role of volunteers into their emergency planning. We focus on how can we ensure the physical, mental, and social safety of volunteers. And finally, of course, the big European program, the European Solidarity Corps, funded by the European Union, how we can make that truly fit for purpose and how we can make it part of a bigger, more comprehensive and more cross-cutting European volunteering policy framework. This is the 5 chapters of the blueprint. We hope that you can have access to it. We can share it with you. You can have a look in more detail at the outcomes in each of these sections that we want to see. We're currently working, of course, on the roadmap towards making those outcomes become the reality, talking to the policymakers at all the different administrative levels that need to be involved. We're also running a series of webinars to explore in more detail each of those chapters. So all of you are, of course, very welcome to join those webinars and also go a bit more deeper into the underlying ideas and underlying outcomes that we want. And we want to emphasize through the whole blueprint, of course, that volunteering is playing a key role in the lives of our generations and, of course, the future generations in preparing the future Europe that future generations which will and should be able to enjoy. We still need to emphasize and re-emphasize how volunteering is the main agent of true social transformation, supporting social inclusion and solidarity, underpinning active citizenship. instilling community resilience and social engagement, and of course promoting shared responsibilities and European values. And we've seen this even more so during the COVID-19 crisis, but also now because of the Russian war in Ukraine and the aggression that we've seen there, and the disaster that's unfolding before our eyes in Ukraine, and all the refugees from the war that are coming particularly into the neighboring states of Ukraine, but also across the whole of Europe. How this and the volunteering approach is really part of this idea of shared responsibilities and European values that we want to underpin. And we finish and focus very strongly that volunteering is, of course, one of the big ways that we can prevent hate speech, promote inclusion and tolerance, contribute to an intergenerational approach, and enable citizens to be directly active in developing the Europe they strive for, and hopefully contribute to a more peaceful Europe and a peaceful resolution of the war that we have at the moment, which is really underpinning and coloring everything that we do around volunteering and civil society. We're of course bringing that up also in the Compass on the Future of Europe, run by the European Union, how volunteering needs to be part of that, and also in our campaign to make 2025 European volunteers. This is another important part of our work. So the blueprint is available for you. It's available in several different languages as well, several different European languages. We hope you will find it useful and stimulating in your own work and in your own work with policymakers. So thank you very much for your invitation. We look forward to engaging with all partners in making this blueprint a reality as well. And here are our contact details. Thank you very much. Thanks, Wendy.
Thank you, Gabriella. And I'll ask all of the panel members to join me now for the discussion. Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's great. I mean, you know, I feel I'm very privileged because I have Lucas and Jurgen and Gabriella beside me. And of course, our paths have woven in and out over the years. So, and with of course, joined by volunteering always, that's the common theme between us. So I'm delighted to have the three of you on the panel. And we have a few questions coming in, and I have a few questions of my own because I find this series that IAVE has been doing really informative, looking at recent research, looking at things that, you know, the pandemic sort of resurged a real interest in volunteering and, you know, looking at it. And you know, I think that has been very useful. So there's been challenge and there's also been opportunity for volunteering. And I think it's important that that does highlight some future things. And there we have CV's new blueprint, which clearly they're looking at seeing this as a watershed moment for volunteering and what should be the next stage. So I want to pick up on something that comes from, firstly, on something that comes from each of your presentations. Lucas, you referred to the spontaneous volunteer, and you know, Jurgen, you referred to individual action, and Gabriella, you referred to non-formal volunteering. And I think this has always existed, you know, but it has been greatly highlighted and accentuated, certainly during the pandemic. And in fact, any disaster, and I think, you know, Gabriella has, you know, referred to the real sad situation that is emerging in Europe, and particularly with Ukraine. So, I mean, you know, disaster does create that energy of volunteering, that willingness to volunteer. So it has always existed. But sometimes you also find there's a tension between that notion of formal and informal volunteering. So I'd like to ask each of you, you know, how can we see this continuum of what I would call volunteering as part of the volunteering family? It's not one's better than the other. It's not that informal is better than formal, or formal is better than informal, or that individual action is better than collective action. But it's how do we create the, you know, the synergy that allows all of that to flourish and for people to recognize it all as part of volunteering. So Lucas, I'll go to you first.
Wendy, thanks. This is a very challenging thing. First of all, this spontaneous kind of thing has always been there. I do agree. But social media, higher educational levels, etc., make it now easier for people to do themselves, right? Without the big help. So that's why we see the big intermediates. That's one. Second, we think you should see it as one part of a big ecosystem. And it might be a weird kind of thing, but we have the spontaneous as the plankton, the things that whales eat. And how does it feed the whole ocean? How do you change over the life people from spontaneous to do something else? And how does that work? So, and the third thing, I think we should train professionals to not see spontaneous volunteers as a nuisance, but as a great resource that they can help, that they can foster, and that they should foster. Because now we see that the first thing spontaneous volunteers hear from an organization is you cannot do this. And that they do not offer an alternative, what you can do. Now, and individuals, if you tell them you cannot do this, what will they do? They will do it. And feel frustrated that this organization told them you should not do this. So it's about becoming volunteer friendly. That's the word.
Thank you. And Jurgen, Lucas picks up on something, about the barriers that sometimes are raised in relation to informal volunteering. This business of it being seen as a nuisance factor. So in the piece of work that you did across the UK, I think you did see some of that. But did you see also examples of where it was embraced as part of that ecosystem?
If I get to that in a second, my first observation is the spontaneous volunteering, or that form of volunteering, is not something that only emerges in crisis. I think it's something that's there all the time, and we just don't see it. In England, they sometimes refer to it as under the radar. It's basically happening all the time. People are doing things together, or organizing themselves in associations, whether or not they're registered or not, all the time. It's an underlying current of our societies, and we just don't see it so well because we're not looking. When come the crisis, we see it. That's when we suddenly, it's thrown into the spotlight. And so now I come to your question. But repeatedly, literally every single time we see this enormous spontaneous outpouring of wanting to help, and then it runs into some form of trouble. Whether or not that was at the 9/11 or in times of flooding in Germany, when the rescue cars couldn't get there because people were driving there, and obviously as well at the moment, the reporting that I hear from Germany about the willingness, for example, to help refugees in Germany, but then the sort of underlying potential threats that can arise from that as well. What I'm saying is this: when it emerges in crisis situation, it runs almost by definition into trouble. Then there is willingness, and there is often, I think the really unfortunate thing is this constantly reports were saying, oh yes, we've learned lessons, the way we can deal with this so much better after disastrous fires like the Grenfell fire in London, or after other instances where we just know that the local authorities were actually getting in the way, or for that matter, volunteers were getting in the way, quite literally. And each time they say lessons will be learned, and each time they're not. Come the next crisis, we're right back at the same spot. So not only is this an underlying current that we always see that only comes into the spotlight in crisis, but we have the twofold. The one where local authorities can be enabling, absolutely, and we found some of that, but they can also go in and be disabling or disempowering, and so the volunteering is almost happening despite rather than with the help of. I don't know whether that, I hope that sort of got to the point of that particular question.
I think it highlights the challenges in terms certainly of looking at this issue. So Gabriella, I get from the blueprint that you are looking at this wide you know, continuum of the volunteering family, if we put it like that, or the definition of volunteering. So what is your take on that? Is do you see that you do need to remove barriers to people's views of informal volunteering or non-formal volunteering?
I think organizations particularly need support in understanding how to interact and how to make sure that both approaches are complementary. But in many countries in Europe, we have the problem, and we had the problem in the pandemic, that it's actually not legal to volunteer in an informal way and to call yourself as a volunteer and act as a volunteer. And there are questions around safeguarding of the people that you're helping, and questions around insurance. And so, you know, it's not the case for all countries, but in cases where there is a very strict legal definition of what is volunteering, and in many of those cases, it's acting in the framework of an official organization. Anything which starts to happen spontaneously outside of that is not within the volunteering. And we did see, and we see it now with the Ukrainian refugee crisis as well. We do see people, not on a huge scale, not to instill panic in people, but there are people that abuse the role of volunteer. There were people saying they were volunteers in the COVID-19 crisis, taking advantage of people, stealing from people, abusing people. We see it now with the Ukrainian refugee crisis, people pretending to be volunteers, and then we see abductions, we see trafficking, we see people disappearing. So, you know, that there has to be some controls and some mechanism and some safeguarding around people calling themselves volunteers in the non-formal, informal framework. And we have to find the right balance as well. So, you know, whilst we do want to embrace, you know, all the outpouring of giving and of time and skills and caring and solidarity, the legal frameworks that have been put in place have usually been put in place for a reason. They've been put in place to safeguard volunteers and also to safeguard society. So we can't completely ignore them and say, you know, there can be a free-for-all and have all kind of informal, non-formal, spontaneous volunteering. We need to keep an eye on the situation, and we need to put in place suitable legal frameworks, as we call them, rather than laws, because then legal frameworks can exist to help these kind of questions. And when something is illegal, it's illegal, whether it's called volunteering or not. So not to put too much doom and gloom on this situation, but you know, it's everything has to be treated with caution, and we have to keep caring for the people that we're trying to help, and also caring for the health and safety and well-being of the volunteers at the heart of what we do.
I think that's you raise a good point there, but it is that balance, you know, and as Lucas has said, social media. So for instance, you know, a call goes out amongst a group of people that casually know each other for a beach clean, say, for something, and they all go off and do it. And, you know, actually at the moment in the UK, they're encouraged to do those kind of environmental projects. And, you know, there's a huge campaign to get together with friends, whatever, and do something. So it is that difficulty of looking at, you know, how you attract the spontaneity, you actually don't dampen it, but also you safeguard those who are wanting to volunteer, as well as safeguard perhaps the people that they're helping. And so it can be quite a challenging balancing act. And one of the questions that we've had from the Q&A is that someone who's really interested in this, and how they want to know, is there a good practice guide, or is there a toolkit in this space that allows people to you know, support people to really organize themselves in a way which would be beneficial to them and to their community. So is there anything out there? Does CEV have anything, Gabriella?
We don't as such, but our members do. Particularly with COVID, there were a number of guides for local groups, particularly informing them of their rights, of their responsibilities, of the legal framework, particularly issues around insurance, public liability insurance, what they can do, what they shouldn't do, what they could do. So there are a few that I'm aware of that have been developed by our members specifically in COVID, but the countries that are more prone to natural disasters, so whether that's fires, floods, earthquakes, also have these things kind of built in, because they know that when these natural disasters, which tend to be thankfully, most of the crises are natural ones in that sense. They know that there will be an outpouring of wish to support through volunteering. So there are already these kind of guidance in place to let people know, how to register with the authorities, how to let people know what they're doing, how to get the right permissions. Even for beach cleans in some countries, you need permission to go and pick rubbish off the beach. So, spontaneous groups who want to do that through great goodwill should somehow be aware that they have to ask for these kind of permissions, and then know how to properly dispose of the rubbish that they collect, which is the second part of what they do. So there are a number of guides around Europe for that, and maybe it's an interesting point. Perhaps we as CV could gather them in one place. That could be an interesting thing for us to do. So
I think there are a number of guides in the UK too, organisations that I know who, saw this as a challenge and wanted to do something about it in order to be able to support volunteering and the ethos of volunteering in their communities. So what IAVE will do is we'll take a little tranche and we'll look and see what's out there. And if any of the three of you know of anything, just hand it over to Jessica and we'll put it up on the website and send it out to the participants who were on this call today. So the other thing I would say is that it's part of the challenge of looking at volunteering globally, because I think we've already said this, that it can be a national response. So it's culture specific, it's country specific, and Gabriella has pointed to the fact that laws are different, and that is exactly right. And culture is different, traditions are different. So some things that work in one place just aren't as easy to work elsewhere because of that. But I think, although we're calling it spontaneous, there is a value about mutual aid, which actually permeates lots of countries where neighbours help neighbours. That is what they've always done. And that's what they will continue to do. One of the other questions that come out of the questions was about the role of the corporate sector and corporate volunteering. And actually this highlights something. The next webinar that IAVE is organizing is looking at the relationship in disaster preparedness and response between corporates and NGOs, non-governmental organizations. So perhaps if I could ask you to say, in what you're doing, do you see, for instance, the future of corporate volunteering or corporate support for volunteering? Do you think it's changing? And in any of your research, what has been highlighted in relation to that corporate engagement? So Jurgen, anything from your research?
Because I would have to be very sort of probably England specific almost. Yes. I think sort of while the overall percentages are still, I would say, below 50%, I think a lot of companies are now looking at employer supported volunteering as part of the sort of corporate responsibility. The interesting part is here, these things only work if you actually enable your employees to take them up. And I think several find out that that's not what they're doing. They're offering something that then nobody can take up, and it's not making a difference, and then they're surprised about that. And I think, yes, in this case, I think our American cousins are leading the way in that, in some respects, where big corporates have a very clear strategy on that, and so they have a stronger lead on that. I do not see a similarly strong lead in it. In England, at least, what I would suggest that in terms of especially preparedness, crisis preparedness, I think there will potentially always be a worry that it can be interpreted as saying, if things get really difficult, you work for free. And that we've seen that in the health services, say come in extra days or whatever else. We've seen that in transport as well, help us, to sort out the trouble at, the difficulty at train stations or something. So earlier you said it's a real challenge. I think it can definitely, and it is on the way of becoming more generally, accepted, and it's a good idea, and I'm not doom and gloom about it at all. I think in the role of emergency preparedness, I'm probably a little bit more skeptical because I see maybe more challenges.
Thank you. And Gabriella, corporate volunteering to CV. I know you've been involved in that for a while now.
Yes, we have, and we're in touch with a number of companies again through our members. They all get engaged in corporate relations to different degrees and at different levels. What we found, in every crisis actually, and now again with the Ukrainian refugees and before with COVID, that people in companies want to do something. The staff of the companies want to do something, and often there is a lack of patience. A lack of awareness that the role of companies and volunteers in companies can come into their own in the following stages, following a crisis. We see it now with the Ukrainian refugees. Many of them wanted to rush to the borders, help with things, donations, whereas that sort of immediate emergency response is much better dealt with by experienced, organized volunteers, experienced organized agencies, where corporate volunteering can and is now really coming into its own. And this is what we tried to tell all the companies that were contacting us in the first few days after the war started, where they can really support now is through integration. Language classes, helping showing people around, helping people with paperwork, helping people with career advice, you know, even just workshops, sports days for the kids. You know, there's all kind of things that employees can do now as regards integration that is much more useful than people rushing in the first few days when everything needs to be much more organized and measured. So it's really important that companies understand that when volunteer organizations say, no, we don't need you now, that they really hear the now part and wait a little bit for the next phase, which is about integration, when company support can really come into its own. Speaking there about volunteers, of course, the company support in giving, you know, free mobile phone SIM cards, free hardware, access to vehicles, you know, all of that kind of pro bono support from the company itself. Of course, that's very welcome also at the very initial stages. But when we talk about volunteer engagement, that's usually more useful in the aftermath of the immediate emergency, when we move on to sort of managing and moving forward to the next steps.
Okay, thank you. And Lucas, you did mention the corporate world when you're talking about that, capturing that energy. So what's your take on that?
The first thing we see is that, generally spoken, all over the world, for companies, it's impossible not to do this. Okay, so where 10 years ago you could say we're not involved, now it's almost impossible to say we're not going to do this. That does not mean they will do it heartfully or on a big scale, but saying no is impossible there. That's the one thing. The second thing is what we see is that slowly companies are moving from employer-led programs to employee-led programs, where they support the volunteering of employees. And we see this change from early stage career, employer-led programs, to pre-retirement volunteering, employee-led programs. So there's a beautiful thing that you slowly get more time to do volunteering you want to do yourself, instead of the volunteering dedicated by the company. And there, as Gabriella says, is the potential for what we see now, that you want to do something in integration that takes a lot of time. But if the company supports your volunteering, then you free up time and possibilities. And that's an important kind of thing. For companies, it's a problem because they can less easily communicate it. Companies love misery. Company loves one thing. They don't love people helping out others, because communication officers cannot communicate that. We cannot measure it. If you look at the IAVE publication, it's all about the things that you can picture. We should have more attention for companies support the things which you cannot make a picture of, all right? So, and the last thing we see is that companies can play, if they want, a huge role in making volunteering more inclusive, because what they do now in corporate volunteering is a very exclusive or a very specific group within their employees. If we urge companies, especially the ones who have large, lower skilled employees, to put it that way, to not only make the corporate volunteering available for the young trainees and the professionals, but also for the people in the factories, then we can make volunteering much more inclusive by using the corporate force. It's something we need to tell them as volunteer involving community.
Yes, something. I think that relationship between the volunteer involving community and corporates is very important, you know, and how can you make that partnership approach work really well, you know, for everyone. And that includes the community and the corporations themselves. So yes, still a little bit of work to be done there, I think. One of the other questions that we had, interesting question, we've had some questions about laws and, you know, the different laws that, you know, affect volunteering and across Europe. And I don't think we've time to go into that, you know, fully today, but I think it's an acknowledgement that country laws can impact on volunteering. They can enable and they can act as a barrier as well, depending on what they are. But one of the things we've had is an interesting question. And for me, it's a little bit of like an age-old question. It goes to the notion of volunteer expenses. So the question is about those volunteers who receive out-of-pocket expenses and those volunteers who don't. And what do we think about the commitment? Do we think there's a different commitment between those volunteers who receive out-of-pocket expenses and those who don't? Now, I may have my own response to that, but I would like to hear from the panel. So, Gabriella, what's your take on that?
I don't think I've ever considered or asked the question about commitment as regards that. I think for us, the bottom line is about inclusion and covering the expenses of volunteers. Makes volunteering more accessible to a wider variety of people. We don't want volunteering to be something that only you know, wealthy people can't afford to do. We want volunteering to be something that people of all socioeconomic situations and backgrounds can have access to do, and we don't want you know, financial capacity to be a barrier to that. So for us, it's all about inclusion and hoping that organizations can find the way that they can cover the out-of-pocket expenses of the volunteers. In some countries, again, legally, it's obligatory to pay these expenses. Then, of course, in practice, that means that some organizations cannot exist because they don't have the money to pay these expenses. So that's when we move into the more informal areas. So it's not an easy question, but for us, it's a question of inclusion and as much as possible, expenses relation to travel, meals, equipment should be covered by the organization in question so that everybody can have the chance to volunteer.
Thank you. Lucas, anything to add to that?
Yeah, thanks. It really, we find that it really depends on how you compensate the out-of-pocket expenses. So if you use the system that people really have to prove the expenses, it doesn't really influence the commitment, and it's really about being inclusive. But if you do it connected to the amount of hours they work, so the Dutch system, you're allowed to give 1,800 euros without administration, that there is real cost, as to make it easier for the non-profit organizations to administrate this. But if you translate that one to an hourly rate, then you suddenly see low commitment. Then you suddenly see that people have something like, hey, but I'm supposed to volunteer for 5 hours because I get 5 hours this out-of-pocket expenses compensated. And then they stop after these 5 hours. So it is really how you distribute this money that seems to influence this. I can give terrible examples about this where you really see people, and it might not even be the volunteer themselves, but it might also be the family relations, the partners, that see it as different. If you compensate it per hour as a kind of out-of-pocket expenses, overtime suddenly becomes a problem.
Yes.
Working longer. So it is not paying the expenses is very good for inclusiveness, but the way you cover these expenses might be very bad for commitment if you connect it to the hours worked.
Yes.
Might be very Dutch.
I think the question was around out-of-pocket expenses, so it wasn't necessarily a sense of being a reimbursement attached to ours. It was about the actual expenses. But I mean, not all organizations across the world can do, you know, they wouldn't have the funds to be able to do that, you know, to even cover out-of-pocket expenses for their volunteers. Although we may consider in Europe that that's a really, really good practice issue, but it's sometimes more difficult globally. Any comment, Jurgen?
certainly support both what Lucas and Gabriella said about being able to pay expenses, out-of-pocket expenses is a great way, or at least helping somewhat towards more inclusivity. It still doesn't resolve inclusivity by any means, but it's at least something. If we just think that people who haven't got their own car or whatever else and need to get on public transport, if the public transport isn't there, then all the out-of-pocket expenses won't help. But so the issue, and if you look at Lucas's comment, and also you saying connecting it to commitment, I think is where we have this gray line between volunteering being seen as an activity that is in fact beneficial and that's done purely out of free will, and or when it shifts to some form of being viewed as well as unpaid work. And I think that's this sort of grey line that is often needs to be explored more formally. But I don't, as a researcher, I should not like a fudge, but I do like the United Nations fudge. Really do like it. They say it should be done not predominantly for financial reasons, and I think that is a fair fudge. It basically means, yes, it would be, it's right and proper to get some, recompense for whatever else, but I'm not doing it is to make a living or whatever else. And I think that's when that's off balance. So I like the United Nations fudge on that one.
Yes, I like that too, because it is a, it's very different and very in a great number of parts of the world. Now we're running out of time rapidly, and I have one big question left that I would like to ask each of you. And it's looking at this question about creating an enabling environment for volunteering. Now you've all touched on it in different ways, and Lucas has talked about the ecosystem, and Gabriella's talking about a sort of system that enables volunteering to support social transformation, and Jurgen has talked about enabling people to volunteer and the response to COVID and the lessons learned from that. And so I'm really interested in, for each of you, I'm going to give you a little, just a moment each to think, but I'm interested in the 3 key ingredients that you think create the enabling environment for volunteering to flourish. Now, I say volunteering to flourish because there can be an enabling environment for volunteering, but I think we're all in the business here of making the most of volunteering, of encouraging more people to volunteer, enabling people to have a say in how their community works and how they can contribute to that. So what do each of you think are the 3 key ingredients that create that enabling environment for volunteering to flourish? So Lucas, I'm going to start with you as our first presenter.
All right, thanks. 1, force volunteer involving organizations to become very volunteer energy friendly. So you start with a volunteer, you don't start with a function. Second, involve as many third parties as possible that have access to people that usually will not volunteer. It's very kind of problem that we see in our research that high schools having some kind of mandatory civil service or volunteering. I'm not sure you want to call it that way, that's up to you, but it helps because volunteering is learned behavior and you have to learn it at a certain moment. Third, think about the way that you say goodbye to your current volunteers, because usually people say, oh, you stopped volunteering, which you would never say to someone who stops working for you. Then you ask, where's the new job? So ask, where is the new volunteering? We are all responsible for maintaining the volunteer energy resource.
Thank you. And Jurgen?
I have got 3 and I will provide them, but I want to put a challenge right back, and partly because of the English or the UK government's use of that sort of creating a specific environment. Actually, they had reversed that. They wanted to make a negative environment, preventing people to do certain things, or to not, in this case, not to come to the UK. And I think whenever we think about it in terms of actually setting environment, we always just be caution is what I advise. Having said that, my 3 clear key ingredients for being a helpful, or being a good idea for volunteering is, first of all, get out of the way. Get out of the way. Just don't do anything. Let people get on with stuff. Second, listen to the people who are actually doing things. Go talk to volunteers, talk to the volunteer involving organizations, listen to them, work with them. And third, help only when you're asked. Don't come up with your own ideas and impose that on others and say, this is what you should be doing. If volunteers together come up with an idea and they want to save that river, or to do that sport, or help with the community social care, help them. Provide the finances that might be needed, or whatever else. This is a little bit facetious in terms of I'd only just thought them up, and B, that's not as simple. But those would be the 3 that I would provide.
Thank you. And Gabriella? Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
Done it now. A little bit more institutional, cross-sectoral approach. Volunteering associations, volunteering infrastructure organizations need to work with and alongside public authorities, with and alongside for-profit institutions as well. So there needs to really be this cross-sector collaboration underpinning everything we do. We also need a better evidence base about the impact of volunteering. When we know more about the impact of volunteering in a proper researched and evidence-based way, we can plan better for the future, and we can strategize better about what our volunteers need to be doing when and where. And we also need better public recognition for volunteering. Still in Europe, we might like to think that all volunteers are seen as nice and helpful and a lovely thing to be, but unfortunately not all of society sees volunteering in a positive light. So we still have a lot of work to do on the public recognition of what volunteering is, what it means, and what it can achieve.
Thank you. And thank you to the 3 of you. It's been a really interesting conversation. What I love about volunteering is that, the story is never ending, which is excellent. And also that, there's always something new, not only to learn, but to discuss, to debate, to find evidence on. It is, as I've always said, a social dynamic, and therefore it evolves and changes and never stays the same. And it's fascination for me. And that's why it's always lovely to talk about it. So thank you for joining me in the Let's Talk Volunteering conversation today. And I hope our participants have really enjoyed it as much as I have. And thank you very much. Everything will be shared with the participants, and all your details and all your presentations will also be shared. And this is recorded, so people who haven't heard it can have the chance to listen to it at a later stage. So thank you. Thank you, Lucas. Thank you, Gabriella. Thank you, Jurgen. Thank you very much. And just now to say that we are moving on to IAVE's next series of webinars, and the next one will be Volunteering and Disaster Preparedness, which is on May the 24th. So if you haven't already registered for that, please do look at these dates and do register now. The value of your contribution as participants is always welcome. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you.
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.